I'm going to talk about the role of copper money within the dynamics of sovereign debt in 17th century Spain. Yeah, it is basically, I based my research on sources, on the reaction that contemporaries had against the introduction of unsound fiat money. That is and the role that played within the dynamics of sovereign debt. Now we have that in Castile, the constitution stipulated against the introduction of any tax, yeah, and also against the debasement of coinage, because that's in a way a form of tax when coin is debased. This is not unusual, and in medieval Europe you find it basically everywhere. We have sources, medieval sources such as Nicolas d'Orem in France, who talk about this issue. Yes, and it's basically in most medieval European constitutions you have this element that prohibits the monarch from debasing coinage. It is quite a serious offense against the people to do that. Yes, and this was put into the Castilian constitution in the early 14th century, after the Cortes of Madrid in 1329. This was basically formally introduced into the Castilian constitution. I talk about Castile because Castile was a kingdom by its own right, and it had an independent monetary system. Each region in Spain had a different form of monetary, different coinage, basically.
I put the microphone on the other side because if you keep touching it all the time, I just hear like this. I'm so sorry. Excusez-moi. Pardon.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so every tax had to be approved by the Castilian Cortes de Castilla, which is the town's council in Spain. Yeah, 18 main towns in Castile form part of this council. Yes, and it's not only that the towns had the right to approve every tax that was introduced. They also had to approve new issues of coinage. Right, all the monetary manipulations that were attempted by the monarch had to be approved by the towns according to the Castilian constitution, and also as a consequence, the towns had determined also the level of debt, of sovereign debt, basically, that the crown could incur into. The reason being the fiscal policy was in the hands of the towns, because the towns authorized the introduction of taxes and also the administration of all these taxes, and the interests payable to consolidated debt, yeah, were also managed by the towns. So everything had to be approved by the towns according to this Castilian constitution. Yeah. Now the problem was the following. In 1597, during the last years of Philip II, there was the representatives of the towns allowed the crown, right, to issue coinage in order to cover a sovereign deficit. And that was a very, very huge mistake from the point of view of the towns, because that allowed the royal, the king to penetrate into this realm of the towns as far as fiscal policy is concerned. Now, how this was justified is through the typical discourse of contingency that we find so often in early modern sources. I mean, Machiavelli is a very, very typical example. Yes, we have. Also, we have to take into consideration the fact that towards the late 16th century, we have the introduction of the coin mill. So production costs, coinage costs dropped dramatically through this technological advancement. So it made sense for the monarch to gather income through inflation, basically. Yeah, so through inflation tax. So these things will have to be taken into consideration. Now, how did the people reacted when they were faced to this transformation of money? Because they were quite used to commodity money from the time before then, right? Now there was a huge reaction, and various treatises were produced, yeah. And each the treatises, the evolution of the treatises are in line with the development of the coinage, right? The level of debasement that was carried out, and also the possibility for this development to be reversible. Yeah. Now we have, why did this happen? We have that after the death of Philip II, this happened in 1598. Basically, most of the income derived from taxes was already basically committed to paying the consolidated debt, because it was quite huge already. So the crown was eager to find new sources of income, right? And it had this restriction by the towns, because every new tax that had to be introduced had to be approved previously by the town's council, right? Now, when we look, we find very often in recent work that, well, by economists basically, not by historians, but economists like to generalize the concept of sovereign debt and commit anachronisms and basically generalize it to every single era, right? And that's completely wrong. The concept of sovereign debt has to be studied within the concept of state of each time. And that happens, we cannot assume that the IMF existed in every single era. There's some literature that compares the Genoese bankers in the 16th century to the IMF. The way that they lent money, yeah, was completely different, right? So that is a huge anachronism, and we have to be very careful in recent literature not to come across these things. But anyway, the work the way that it worked was the following. There was the towns had to did not only approve the level of taxation, but they approved also how much money was going to be issued in form of bonds. Bonds that were basically sovereign debts. Those bonds were called juros, and they were introduced after the Spanish reconquest, and people used it as a source of for instance, as pension. They were originally introduced to give pensions to the soldiers who fought during the reconquest in the 8th, 9th, and 10th centuries. So it is. It was that the juros, and basically the way that foreign debt functioned at that time was basically through the idea that it had to be a collateral loan, right? The Genoese bankers lent money to the crown, yeah, but that loan had to be guaranteed by something, right? So it's completely different from the way the IMF carries out loans nowadays, right? The IMF, what it does, it imposes certain political, fiscal policies that the country has to follow. This austerity programs, etc. Right? That's a completely different concept to the way that foreign debt was in the early modern period. Yeah, and this happened not only in Spain, also in England. The Genoese bankers loaned money to many monarchies in Europe, and that was the way that they loaned. They had to have a guarantee. So whatever they lent to the monarchies, there had to be sort of like an assurance that that loan was going to be paid back, and that assurance was done through promising tax revenues, right? So there had to be this guarantee. So further loans couldn't be acquired, yes, if previous loan, the money that was already owed to the Genoese bankers, wasn't transformed into consolidated debt. Yeah. Once that happened, that money that was short-term loans that were offered by the Genoese bankers, yes. Once those loans were transformed into consolidated debt. Yeah, sorry. Yes. Then, and only then, could the monarchy acquire more loans from the Genoese bankers. Okay. Now, that made sense from the point of view of the interest rate, because it was quite high. The interest rate that the Genoese bankers charged, it was 12% during the first year, and then it dropped to 8%, which was quite high. I mean, the interest rate payable for the consolidated debt was only 6%, 5 or 6%. So it made sense to do this from the point of view of the crown. So. Now, there was a speculation element when it came to how much money the crown was able to get as a loan from the Genoese bankers, because if the arrivals of precious metals were expected to be high, well, then the Genoese bankers were more willing to lend money to the crown, right? So there was an expectations element there. Also, the people, when fiat money was issued, they were more willing to take that fiat money if they were expecting that silver would arrive. Yes. So there's always an expectation element when it comes both to debt and to monetary issues at that time. Now, the problem was, we know this very well from Hamilton's series, that the precious metals that arrived from Spanish America started dropping off. They reached a peak towards the end of the 16th century, as you can well see. Yeah, but then they started dropping. The arrivals started dropping. You know, you see the blue. The blue is what the crown would receive. The red is what the private individuals would receive, and the green is a total, basically. So after the end of the 16th century, there was a drop. Yeah, the arrivals started declining. Yeah. And this was also, I mean, we have to see this within the context of the history of technology. We see that, well, the introduction of the process of amalgamation had as a consequence a surge in the production of silver, right? But once that settled and the ores were exhausted, gradually the production started declining. Also, we have to take into consideration the declining population during that time in Spanish America. Yeah, but well, we know that that's not necessarily the case, because Dennis already told us many years ago that some of this data have very little to do with the actual production that was taking place in America, because the metals were also flowing the other way from America directly to Asia, right? So this these numbers have to be reassessed. And actually it has been found out that the production, there was an upward trend in the production of the Peruvian mines, yeah, at least for the first half of the 17th century, whereas the production of Mexican mines had a steady decline throughout the century, right? And this was due to the decline in population, right? That is clear. But this is material for my Madrid paper, not this paper. But they do link together. That's why I mentioned it. Now, we know that Spain was involved in the 30 Years' War. Yeah. So all the silver that came from America was directed to the Genoese bankers so that they would forward it to cover the demand for military expenses that had to be carried out due to to the 30 year Spain's involvement in the 30 Years' War. So that was a huge expense for Spain, right? And of course, the higher the expectations of precious metals arriving, well, the higher the capacity of the crown of borrowing money from the Genoese bankers, right? So this happened. Now, the medios generales were the meetings that happened when the crown decided to increase the amount of money that it would borrow from the Genoese bankers. So I explained already what that entailed. It was basically the conversion of floating debt into consolidated debt, right? And that gave space for the acquisition of further loans from the Genoese. Yeah. Now, where does the issue of debasement fit into this circle? Basically, as you can see, the towns determined how much money basically the crown could borrow, right? Of course, there were negotiations, but they were quite strong in the bargaining position, right? And we see, especially with Olivares, when Olivares became the minister of Philip IV, his tendency was to centralize the fiscal system, right? And through coinage, there was a possibility of enhancing this centralization, yeah, in fiscal policy, right? In fact, the seigniorage that was obtained out of this coinage was an element that was taken into consideration after 1619, yeah, for the crown to get further credits from the Genoese. So in a way, it was sort of a separation, of fiscal policy out of the hands of the towns and into the hands of the crown. Right. Well, this was done through a mistake, yeah, because it was allowed. Basically, there was a huge amount of corruption, yeah, according to Juan de Mariana, basically, who wrote extensively about this, and it was basically the representatives of towns allowed this intrusion of the crown into the realm of the fiscal policy of the towns out of corruption, and that spoiled the whole Castilian system of representation, basically. Now, this is an example of the evolution of one of the four Maravedi coin. Right? It's just, I took that coin as an example. There were coins of other denominations, but just to illustrate how the decline in silver content that was carried out basically during this time, I mean 1597, yeah, when the coin mill was introduced. And so the value weight ratio, I don't know if you can see this, declined dramatically, right? see a departure from parity in the first few 2 decades because, well, basically there was money scarcity. So the first issues of coinage were welcome, right, by people because they needed that money for transactions. Also, it was not clear what was going to happen to the precious metals at that time. There was this expectation element. People were relying perhaps on an increase in the arrivals of precious metals from the Spanish colonies, right? But yes, we can see that a clear decline in the value-weight ratio, of these coins, copper coins, that were originally made out of an alloy of silver and copper, and then they became pure copper towards the third decade of the 17th century. Yeah. Now this, I'm going now to talk about the treatises that emerged as a reaction of to this phenomenon, and the most significant one was Juan de Mariana. Yeah. Also significant because he was condemned by the Inquisition for writing these things. Yeah. This is due to the fact that previously he had published another book called De Rege et Regis Institutione, where he condemns. Where he states that the tyrant, it is completely legitimate to kill the tyrant, to execute the tyrant, right? And in this treatise, which is about the moneta mutazione, about the alterations of the coin, he claims that coin debasement is a tyranny. So as a consequence, he was suggesting that the monarch should be executed because he was a tyrant. So that's why he was condemned to, he was put in prison in a convent for most of his life later on. He was released when he was very old, and then he died 3 or 4 years afterwards. So it was quite a sad story. But basically, he condemned this issue of debased coins. Yeah, very strongly. He pinpointed that it was the town representatives who had allowed this penetration of royal power into the realms of the town. And he also spots that the justification for this had been the necessity, the language of contingency that was used to do this. Now the procuradores were basically the representatives of the towns in the town's council, and it was them who were. I mean, he claims they were corrupt, and that's how this penetration of royal power came about. Now, Mariana opposes to coin debasement. He bases same arguments as Nicolas Lorem. He doesn't quote him directly, but he does. He argues in the same way. He does quote Philippe de Comines, right? And he mentions that episode that you find in Philippe de Comines when Kaiser Friedrich II, was in Italy, looting towns. Well, he doesn't say that because they were supposed. He was an example. He was in the Italian town of Farezza, and they were in siege. The army was in siege, so Friedrich issued money made out of leather. Yeah, he used his royal stamp to issue money made out of leather. But this is siege money, right? So he analyzes whether or not it is legitimate, even in a situation of siege, for a monarch to issue money without the consultation of the towns. Towns in his case, or whoever should be involved according to the constitution. And he comes to the conclusion that it is not legitimate. Even siege money, even the issue of siege money should, in theory, be consulted with the states that have a stake in these issues. Okay. So this is Mariana. So he opposes structurally. He was appalled about coin debasement from the beginning, right? But coin debasement continued as I showed before. Yeah, continued. He wrote it in 1609, right? So coin debasement continued as we can see here, and I covered this already. So we move towards the second decade of the 17th century, and we see that we have, well, the people in Spain, there was this culture of trying to give advice to the king. It was part of this representation culture that was prevailed in Spain, and this there were many treatises issued that gave advice as to how to solve monetary problems, right? And an interesting one is Pedro López de Reynos, right? He is in favor at this point of a monetary reform. Now, silver was scarce at that time. Very, very little silver was arriving from the colonies, and what he advises the king to do is to take the silver that was still circulating, melt it down, and melt down all the debased coins that were circulating too, and a new currency should be issued, right, with a higher intrinsic value. Yeah. Now, if we analyze this, it looks like it is a solution that proposes a reversible situation, but it is not really reversible, because basically the exchange wouldn't be done, the nominal value wouldn't be respected of the copper coins that were circulating already. So there would be a premium to change copper coins for this currency that he's suggesting, right? So there is a transfer of public debt, basically, yeah, through money from the king to the subject by doing this. So this is López de Reino, who wrote towards the, it was 1618 when his treatise was produced. Now we move further on. I mean, when 7 years later, we see that the situation exacerbated, right? And the silver premium started increasing quite dramatically, because the silver arrivals from the colonies were quite low still, right? So the possibility for this problem to be reversible were increasingly thin, basically. And well, other stabilization proposals were put forward, and one of them was Gerardo Bassos, which actually was a stabilization proposal that was put into practice, right? It was as a way to solve the monetary crisis that was taking place in Castile at that time. I mean, there were others. I mean, there were many others. There was an interesting one that I mentioned in my paper, which suggests to take the silver from the altars for all this. I mean, it's quite a secular stance to take, because, you know, in Spanish churches there's a lot of silver still, no? I mean, all this silver that was in altars and in all these chalices, yeah, used for the liturgy, for the Catholic liturgy, should be collected and molten down, and a new currency should be issued out of that. So you find all sorts of proposals that put forward solutions to this problem. But Gerardo Bassos is very, very interesting. It's Gerardo Bassos was a Milanese merchant, yeah, and he didn't have a very good reputation in Spain, because he was a copper merchant, so he was importing all the copper that was causing the monetary problem, and then he became advisor to the king, and he was putting forward solutions to the problems that he had indirectly caused. But he was quite an interesting character, and his text is quite. I mean, he shows knowledge about the exchange rate situations throughout Europe at that time. I have transcribed his work, and it's been published in Georges' series, Gerardo Bassos. It's quite a good source also for information about exchange rates during the 1630s. Yeah, he talks about the relationships between coins and throughout Europe in other financial centers also. So it's also a good source for if you're interested in finding out about the exchange rate. But he was basically, his idea was to collect money, to found some banks, yeah, and put them in each main town. And those banks had as a role to collect all the debased money, yeah, and then exchange it for credit certificates, right? Those credit certificates would pay an interest of 5%, yeah. And once the crown gathered more silver, because he was expecting the silver production would perhaps increase, yeah, nobody knew what was going to happen, right? So that there is basically a Bayesian element in this thinking. So there is. So it was. They were expecting for new silver to arrive in Spain, and once that happened, right, a new currency would be introduced, and those credit certificates would be exchanged again for this new currency with a higher intrinsic value. So again, this proposal looks like it's going to reverse the problem, but it's not really reversible, because how this scheme was going to be founded, it was going to be through the increase in taxes. So in a way, it's a swap of inflation tax for other types of taxes on wine and other commodities. Yeah. Now, there was an interest during 1627. It is, I mean, it's a very important time, because it was the exchange rate was increasing, was depreciating basically at that time, and a large number of proposals were put forward in order to solve this problem, because the effects of debasement were being felt at that time. So this is a very interesting treatise that was put forward. So this person realized, it's Tomás Cardona's, it's an anonymous source, and it's a handwritten source, it's a manuscript. I'm transcribing it at the moment, and it's anonymous, but it's believed to be to belong to have been written by Tomás Cardona, who published other treatises concerning coins in Spain at that time. So basically he realizes there's no silver. So the only metal that is available to the crown is copper. Yeah, copper that was not even produced in Spain, but yeah, Spain could import it from Sweden, and Sweden was flourishing at that time thanks to the demand that was created in Spain for this copper. Right? But anyway, this is another issue. But so his idea was to create a currency made out of copper, right? And because the transport costs in order to carry out transactions with that currency would be enormous, right? His idea was to leave those coins in a bank, yeah, and issue basically transportation notes, right? Well, the equivalent of were transportation notes in Sweden, yeah, but it's basically representative money. What he's suggesting, yeah. So the intrinsic it's fiat, not even fiat money. It's representative money. Whatever circulated in paper had the nominal value was guaranteed by this copper the copper stored in the banks. So it was a very innovative, basically it was the idea of founding a central bank, because those banks were going to be independent not only from the crown, but also from the towns. So it was sort of like an independent bank that was to be in charge of the currency. Of course, the king had certain power over them, but they would be outside the jurisdiction of the towns. Yeah, these banks. So it was in a way the plea to introduce representative money. However, if we analyze his treaty a bit more closely, we see that when he focuses on the exchange, the actual exchange of debased money for these certificates, yeah, that would circulate in lieu of the big copper coins, yeah, there would be a premium, yeah, paid by the subjects in order to obtain the certificate. So, in a way, the subjects would be taxed, yeah, for the consequence of debasement. So there was no way out. I mean, all these treatises look like they're suggesting reversibility, but there's no reversibility at this point. People are trying to accept, to come to terms with the fact that they had lost money by using these debased coins, right? And they had to come to terms with that because the currency was devalued in 1628 by 50%, yeah, and there was no way back after that. The crisis continued till the 1680s, right? And there was no way back after that. So that basically the valuation was the acceptance of this unsound fiat money that had been circulating. Okay, so my conclusions are the following. Yeah, I put forward this suggestion, and it is I mean, given the political structure of Castile, which is basically the fiscal system was fragmented, yeah, and there was an absence of an institution that would guarantee sound fiat money, yeah. So the only possibility that gave the towns independence in terms of monetary policy from the sovereign was to have commodity money, sound commodity money at that time, given the scarcity of other financial assets that would have been used to substitute this commodity money. Yeah? So commodity money was in line with the political structure of the kingdom. Yeah? And through this commodity money, the towns would gain control over monetary policy. Otherwise, they would lose control, which is what happened de facto. Now, all monetary reforms designed were, well, there's a hidden tax, as I have explained already. They look like they reverse the problem, but really the subjects were taxed in one way or the other in order to carry out these reforms. Or we can see this as a swap of the inflation tax for another type of swap. Yeah? And even the proposal that suggests the introduction of representative money, right? It includes a tax there too, and not only that, I mean, it would have distorted the whole of the political system, right? It was too, I think it was too early. I mean, that society was not prepared for such a program, because we can see that it is basically a central bank. What this author suggests is to found a central bank, and well, a jump from a basically society where where the towns bear such a strong stake when it comes to fiscal policy, to alienate the towns on one step, yeah, by instituting a central bank that is, I mean, to my knowledge, that didn't happen anywhere, right? That's why we see that only in the 18th century that central banks were found, national central banks were founded. Of course, we have the Bank of Amsterdam in 1609, yeah, it was found, but central banks like the one suggested here, we see only in the 18th century throughout Europe. Okay, thank you very much. And sorry about my slides.